In this episode of Chinese Steam Locomotives, I will go over the history of the handsome Chinese Railways SL6 Class 462 Pacific and the somewhat less attractive but just as useful RM Class 462 Pacific steam locomotives. First is the SL6 class. This class of locomotive was originally built by Japan between 1934 and 1940. 422 of these locomotives were built. These locomotives were built for passenger service and had relatively high drivers at 68 and 7/8 inches tall. They were derived from light Pacifics built by the American Locomotive Company and are extremely similar in looks to 462 Pacifics like the ones used by the Florida East Coast Railway. One of these locomotives, built by Alco in 1920, is operational in Clewiston, Florida today. A slightly modified version of the SL6 class was built between 1937 and 1944 and did not have feed water heaters and had smaller tenders because of the smaller turntables being used by the Manchukuo National, and 125 of these variants were built in those years. Eventually, more of these locomotives would be built by different Japanese manufacturers in 1934 and other batch between 1936 and 1938, and then again from 1940 to 1943. These high-stepping Pacifics pulled passenger trains all over China for many years and served the railroads well. One interesting characteristic of these engines was that they produced a strange whistling noise from the exhaust bead. This can be heard in many video and audio clips of SL6s running. In 1941, an additional 8 SL6s were ordered and built. The manufacturing of the SL6 was restarted again in the 1950s by the Chinese themselves, but these early SL6s were built by several different Japanese manufacturers. Two of note were Kawasaki and Hitachi. It's strange to think of these companies building steam locomotives. In all, 254 of these early SL6s were built and run all over the country of China. The class was officially named the SL6 class in 1959. An additional 151 SL6 locomotives were built by China itself at the Sifang Locomotive Works and were the main locomotive used in China's passenger trains for many years. Many of these later SL6s had smoke deflectors along the smoke box. The early engines had standard spoke drivers, while the later ones had box drivers. Sadly, as passenger trains became heavier in the 1970s and 80s, they were often regulated to other duties. By the 1990s, nearly all of the SL6s had been replaced by larger, heavier engines, and most were scrapped or sidelined. Only a few remained in service in the 90s, and by the end of 1991, they had all been retired. "25 SL6s were used by North Korea at the end of the Pacific War, and they were all retired by the end of the 1960s. Sadly, only two examples of an SL6 still remain: SL601 and SL724, and both are preserved in museums in China today. Now on to the RM Class Pacific. These were built between 1958 and 1966, and 258 examples were built in total. The RM class, while being 462 Pacifics like the SL6 class, looked quite different. They had one long combined steam and sand dome with shrouding that covered the smokestack, just like the JS class 282s. And the QJ class 210-2s. The RM class had basically the same driver diameter as the SL6 class. They were heavier and more powerful than the SL6 class, and were the last steam passenger locomotives built in China. Just like the SLs, they were eventually replaced by larger and more powerful locomotives, like the QJ class in the 1970s and 80s. The last RMs were taken out of service in the early 1990s, and the final RM to be used was RM 1183, which last ran in 1991. Strangely, the RM class was retired completely before the previous SL6 class was, making them somewhat less successful than the SL6 class, and making them have less of an impact than the much longer lived and better looking SL6 class. Two RMs have been preserved, RM 1001 and RM 1163. These were very interesting, and important locomotives for China. And the SL6 class remains one of my all-time favorite Chinese steam locomotive classes, only being outdone by the SY Class 282 Mikados and the JF Class 282s. I feel I should also mention briefly the SL7 class, which was a streamlined version of the SL6 class, being nearly identical with the exception of the streamlined shrouding that was added to the locomotives to make them look more modern. Only 12 SL7s were ever built, and all of these were eventually converted to SL6 class engines and had their streamlined shroudings removed. SL7 751 was restored to working condition in 1984. In 2001, SL7 757 was completely restored and was put on display in 2013 and has been ever since. Thank you for watching. My next Chinese steam class video will either be on the QJ2102 class or the narrow gauge 080 class. All of the photos used in this video were slides or postcards that I own.